But some of these problems, like I mentioned before, like crowd diseases and sanitation, weren't really properly planned for. Also, if you have a village of 5,000 people that's all in one big space, how far do you have to walk to get to your field? If you've got 5,000 people and you're all farmers, how many people can be right on the outskirts of the village? How many people's farms can be right there? So there's sort of a limit, a logical limit to how large a single community can be without having satellite communities to support it. This is something we're going to come back to when we get into the urban revolution in subsequent chapters. That it's possible that Çatalhöyük got too big too quickly and didn't really think about planning for the future. And so some of these negative effects of the shift from hunting and gathering into farming and herding might have been emphasized at Çatalhöyük, and it eventually declined and was abandoned. So that's the Middle East. Now, I mentioned before that Gordon Childe talked about diffusion. I mentioned this before. He was of an era in science where it seemed implausible that two people or two groups of people at different times could invent the same thing. But now we know that that's actually a lot more common than we give credit for. And but that doesn't mean that diffusion didn't take place, that imitation or borrowing or passing down of things from one group to another didn't take place. It just, when we talk about Mesoamerica, it was not, when we talk about Mesoamerican domestication, it did not borrow or have the example of the Middle Eastern domestication from thousands of years earlier. No. But in Europe, it appears that that's exactly what happened. And that's okay to imagine, because it's Europe and the Middle East are really contiguous with one another. We're just talking about Turkey. Turkey extends into Europe, across the Bosporus, and you're in Europe. So it seems as though in Europe there was no indigenous domestication. There were people that lived there that were hunters and gatherers. And there were several waves of advance of probably some people moving from the Middle East, at least in southeastern Europe at about 8,500 years ago, and then Central and Western Europe 7,500 years ago, and the far reaches of Western Europe finally getting some of these changes about 6,000 years ago. And it appears as though it was a combination of things, that there were probably some migrants moving into Europe, but of course there were people already living in Europe at that time. So it must have been some population increase in the Middle East that led to expansion out of the Middle East into Europe. And so expansion of territory of people that were probably being displaced. This also ties to what we now really consider to be language dispersal theory, that it wasn't just people, it was everything that went with them. So it was their language, it was their cosmology, it was their way of life. And even though there wasn't a total replacement of people in Europe, the people that lived there were still living there, but they started to adopt all sorts of new lifestyles, including agriculture and farming. Sometimes they competed, sometimes they resisted, but eventually things like languages did become replaced. There's really only one that we think predates this language dispersal period, Indo-European languages that probably come from the Caucasus region and went out to India and into Asia and then up into Europe. And that's the Basque language, which has no cognates in any other language. It's not really related into any other language family. And so it might very well be a it may be a Neolithic language or Epipaleolithic language, Mesolithic language. But most of the other languages that we see in Europe actually all seem to relate to some origin point, probably in the Middle East. And so that's reflective of a movement of people, movement of lifestyle, movement of languages. So the hunter-gatherers that were in Europe adapted to incomers, and they, once I said before that you don't want freeloaders on your land, right? If you're growing crops, you can't deal with that. You need them to stay out of your fields. They didn't grow those. Their life doesn't depend on it. They can go someplace else. But if you're a hunter and gatherer, you're like, why? I don't understand. This is just food, and I want it. I've been doing this my whole life and for generations, so why don't I just take the food? So that can create conflicts, or it can create capitulation, and it can create create some sort of mediation. So at a place in the Iron Gates region, the Lipinski Vir site, from about 8,400 to 7,600 years ago, these Mesolithic or Middle Stone Age, it's the same as the Epipaleolithic period in the Middle East, Mesolithic hunter-gatherers were living alongside farmers. And so we see that this interaction was taking place. For over much of Europe, you have this culture called the linear band ceramic, or LBK, which was, once again, I said pot, stone equal people, but it seems to be a pretty unified cultural group. They grew Middle Eastern crops, so crops that didn't exist in Europe were brought in and cultivated. And they also herded Middle Eastern animals. So you have not just people coming in, probably, but you also have cattle and pigs and sheep and goats and wheat and barley and these sorts of things. They lived in, but they practiced slightly different ways of life. So this may be this fusion of European hunter-gatherers with Middle Eastern survival strategies, and maybe even fusion of groups of people together. And in the linear band ceramic, the LBK, they lived in large extended families and lengthy long houses, big, huge, long 90-foot houses, unlike in the Middle East, as we've seen, which were much smaller, more compact. There was violence that we see between communities. So this wasn't always a peaceful transition. There were interaction between the farmers and hunters, which created trade and exchange, but sometimes less peaceful interactions. That's this chapter, and so we're going to pick this up again, and we'll start talking about another occurrence of independent occurrence of the Neolithic Revolution in the next chapter 8. See you then.